Well, we're just waiting for participants to come in. We're up
Yay.
to about 30 right now. So I will just say hi right now. And I'm Kim Haig. I'm the president this year of Wild Ones of Greater Kane County. And I'm just so glad that you are coming to it. This is our regular meeting time, and we're also having a really wonderful presentation, which I think you will really enjoy. I am really looking forward to it. I'm not going to say a whole lot. We have other people on this committee here who are going to be speaking. Mary Alice is going to be talking about our last plant sales that we had. And only thing I want to say that's new and exciting for us is that the farmers market of Elgin has asked us if we would like to have a booth there. And it's on Fridays from 3 till 7. So we're going to be there for sure on June 4th and June 11th. Kane County Forest Preserve is going to share some of those times with us. And we're going to be handing out information about wild ones, about the Forest Preserve, and also about the Conservation Foundation, which is one of our partners. So if anyone would like to volunteer to man or woman that booth, please just email me. And my email is going to be in the chat because you might need it for other things. So we're really excited about this opportunity to spread the word about wild ones and about basically about native plants and native habitats. So right now, I also want to introduce Peggy Steichen. Peggy can just wave a little bit. So she's our vice president this year, and also she does a wonderful job with volunteers. So she's such a good addition to our little group here. So I'm going to turn it over to Mary Alice Masonic, who is in charge of our plant sales. Take it away.
Good evening and welcome, everybody. Right now, we are wrapping up our 9th annual native plant sale. Our member sale was very successful. We sold 220 native trees and shrubs and 4,400 native plants. And these were all ordered and paid for in advance. So it was a real success. We distributed the plants on 2 dates in May. And then we had our public sale last weekend, and it was somewhat successful. We have been impacted by the COVID-19 restrictions, so we did not have the turnout that we usually have of customers. But we do have a lot of leftovers, over 900 I counted. And if you're interested in buying leftovers at half price, we have been sending out emails. Kim has been. And if you want to get that list and have not received it, send an email to Kim, and her email will be in the chat. So please know that we've got lots of leftover plants if you're interested. Oh, and now I'm introducing Luann, I do believe.
You can introduce me, and then I'll introduce Nancy Lamaya.
Yeah, well, actually, it's Peggy next to talk about
I can
volunteers.
talk about something here.
Right.
Yeah.
So hello, everybody. Good evening. Good to talk to everybody and see everybody. So I just wanted to give a quick little shout out to all of our wonderful volunteers. So we had 4 separate planned events, one for our trees and shrubs, one for the member pre-orders, our public sale, and then like a setup for the public sale. So we had great turnout. You know, one day was a little stressful, but you volunteers know what we're talking about. So yeah, so just a big hearty thank you, and keep on doing what you're doing. And I love my volunteers. Without you guys, like I can't do any of this, right? So enjoy the rest of the evening. We have a great topic here to talk about with Allison, and I'd like to introduce Luann now.
Yay. Nancy, do you want to talk before I talk, or do you want to?
Yeah, let me just say that with all these new plants and the plants from the Elgin Sustainability Commission that they paid for and that Mary Alice and Kim made possible on top of the plant sale that they already do, it's absolutely astounding. So we've been distributing plants to people who are newly adding natives to their yards or swales in some cases. For instance, we have the Swan neighborhood is having actually that's where Start in Your Yard is starting, in the Swan neighborhood. and we're working with the swales that were built into the tree banks there. So on Saturday, June 5th, we're going to be having a party. We're going to be turning these renegade swales into good neighbors. And if you'd like to be part of that, come and help. Email me. I put my email in the chat, nancylamaya@gmail.com, and we'll give you particulars, and you can join in. I also want to let you know that on Monday nights during the summer, well, we're going to at least start in June and see how it goes. We're going to hop on to Zoom at 7:30 on Monday night. I mean, you can come straight from the garden, mud and all, and we're going to talk about plants and planting and suggestions and ideas and so forth and so on, with an eye to providing some information to people who are new to planting natives, and also to kind of hold their hands and surround them with enthusiasm and so forth. So allow questions and suggestions. So tell everybody you know to go to startinyouryard.com and look for the link. We're hosting half and the library is hosting half. So you don't have to register anything, just click that link and you're on, and we'll be talking plants. When we talk about distributing plants, the library, I'm so excited about this. The library's grounds team has approved putting native plants at the library. It almost brings tears to my eyes because I love the library and I've always wanted them to have native plants. So that's some good news. Just a couple other things that, so you know they're going on. Sandy Skalski is heading up a group that is working on getting the storm drain art in Elgin, getting the Start in Your Yard plant natives, save, oh, I was going to tell you what it is, but I can't call it to mind. Save the rain, save the drain. It's very close to that.
Okay.
And also Jean Munz, Karen Sherman, and Trish Beckshard are working with landscaping the cobblestone house that is being restored up there on Chicago Street and Crystal. So that's just kind of an overview of some of the things that are going on. Join us on Monday nights during the summer. June 7th is the first one. And join us on June 5th, Saturday, in the Swan neighborhood if you'd like. Thanks.
Mhm. Let's talk about a couple of things that are upcoming. In June, on June 24th at 7 o'clock, April Anderson is going to do a book preview of her book, A Field Guide to Everyday Life. On Saturday, July 24th, Patsy Hirsch will welcome us to her garden tour. On Saturday, August 28th, yay, Angelica Brinkman-Bussey will welcome us to her garden tour. On Thursday, October 28th, Ed Collins celebrates October with us. Now, without further ado, please put all your questions for tonight's program in the Q&A, not in the chat, put it in the Q&A, and we'll deal with them right after this fabulous presentation. I'd like to introduce Dr. Sacerdote-Velat. She's the Curator of Herpetology at Chicago Academy of Sciences of the Peggy Notebaert Nature Museum. She does extremely important field work, including coordinating the Calling Frogs Survey, in which she monitors the frogs, and some are declining in numbers. And hey, if you Google her, you have to go on the page where it talks about her raising adorable baby green snakes. Incidentally, she concentrates on how to help threatened species. I just want to tell you that at her frog presentation for Wild Things, the workshop group was as quiet as a mouse to hear her and the frog calls. So let's see what she has in store for us tonight. Allison?
Thank you. All right, I will try to share my screen here, make sure we have sound. All right. And I just want to thank you for the invitation to speak. I know I spoke with your group a number of years ago about some of our buckthorn research. And before I jump in, can everyone hear me? Because my neighbor's lawnmower just started. So,
We do hear you.
okay, bear with me. I knew that would happen. Yeah, without fail. So I'm really excited to talk to everybody about the frogs of the Chicago region, how we identify them, the types of habitats they use, and most importantly, why we care about them, why they're so critical to monitor and to conserve. And at the Peggy Notebaert Nature Museum, we run 3 different community science programs. So I will put in a quick plug for those. I know some of you are already monitors with our program. I direct the Calling Frog Survey, and my colleagues Doug Tarrant and Alan Lawrence direct the Illinois Butterfly Monitoring Network, as well as the Illinois Odonate Survey. So if you're interested in not just amphibians, but if you're interested in pollinators and dragonflies and damselflies, we do have programs for you to get involved with and to contribute your observations to. So the reason that it's really critical to monitor frogs and toads can actually be a really lengthy list. One of the really interesting things about them is that they occupy the center of the food chain. So they're in the middle. They're feeding on insects, they're feeding on soil arthropods, small zooplankton swimming in the pond. And they're also prey species for larger predators, including fish, snakes, water birds. And because of that, they're this really critical link in our kind of trophic food web. So energy is moving through them, through our ecosystem. All of the grazing insects that a frog might feed on are taking up nutrients from the plants, and it's getting channeled up through amphibians to higher predators. And because they live on both land and in the water, they're moving those nutrients and that energy between the aquatic and terrestrial ecosystem. And this is really important, not just because some animals need particular tasty morsels that they happen to prefer, but we see that the presence of frogs and toads actually really shapes the community structure of a variety of environments. And as an example of that, the work of Dr. Karen Lips in Costa Rica, who I will mention again tonight, she was one of the researchers who first documented the decline of Central American frogs and toads due to the pathogen Batrachochytrium dendrobatitis, or chytrid fungus. And when these stream systems that she was working in started to lose amphibians one by one, she documented a number of changes. She found that the loss of tadpoles changed algal dynamics, fish communities, stream communities. And in recent years, she and some of her colleagues have also seen that it's changing the terrestrial communities as well. The snake community is now exhibiting a collapse linked to the loss of those frogs. So we see this in the real world. We see these examples of how important these animals are as this critical energy and nutrient link for a variety of species. In 1990, it was declared that we had a global amphibian decline phenomenon. Since 1980, the estimate of the number of frog species we lost varies a bit, but the estimates are around 156 to 200 species of amphibians, just since the 1980s. The loss really started accelerating in the 80s and 90s, and in the 1990s, you may remember there was a news story that was in the national press where a small boy found an amphibian, I think he was in Minnesota, with multiple limbs, excess limb deformities. So it was a frog that had 3 legs coming out of one joint essentially. And we started seeing this more and more. And in that case, that form of malformation is linked to a trematode that infects the developing limb buds in tadpoles. And so then as the frogs go through metamorphosis, they start having these deformities. And this trematode was always in the environment. But what we're seeing is that frog resistance weakened. And it has to do with a number of environmental stressors. They're basically at a tipping point where their immune system can no longer fend off the variety of stressors that they have to deal with. So we have road salt, and we have light pollution and noise pollution. We have fertilizer runoff and habitat fragmentation, as well as climate change. And basically, you know, they're small animals, they can only deal with so much. So you start to see this manifestation of things that were always in the environment kind of pushing them over the edge. In 1998, Karen Lips, who I mentioned earlier, actually identified this particular waterborne fungus called Batrachochytrium dendrobatitis as one of the driving factors behind decline of many Central American frog species. This fungus is actually here in Illinois. It's recently been determined that it has been here since 1899, and that was determined using museum specimens. So some researchers, Talley et al., just about 3 or 4 years ago, went through a wide array of museum specimens, and they were trying to detect the presence of this fungus and see how far back they could find it. And the oldest specimen in their study was 1899 from Southern Illinois, and I believe it was a southern leopard frog. But the thing is, the fungus may be endemic. We may have an endemic strain that they always lived with. It didn't always cause this mass die-off. So there's still a lot of questions that we're trying to answer about what is really causing these precipitous declines. In addition to the chytrid fungus, there are other pathogens that amphibians are dealing with. There is ranavirus, which affects frogs. Sorry, that lawnmower is just getting way too loud, so I'm going to move my computer. I really apologize about that. It affects frogs and turtles, as well as fish. And because this is a waterborne fungus, the ability for ranavirus to spread is really quite great. It is spreading both through vectors like birds landing in a particular pond and transporting it on their legs to other places. It could be spread by people, it could be spread by the animals themselves. And that type of virus actually causes these episodic die-offs. So it is very problematic. We do have it in the region. It crops up and then it disappears after typically a die-off episode. And it's something that, you know, a lot of researchers in Illinois are doing quite a bit of surveillance for. And there are other infections and things that they're dealing with. There's a disease called Perkensia, which is also kind of an emerging pathogen. It's actually been around since the 1930s, but we're only really learning about it because it's also this kind of episodic pathogen that they're dealing with. So all of these things together have really led to the declaration that there is a global amphibian extinction crisis. And because of that, it's really critical for us to see what is happening with the amphibians in our region and how can we basically keep tabs on what their populations are doing, whether they're increasing or decreasing, and we can try to come up with ways to help them, ways to address and mitigate the threats that persist in the environment. So here in the Midwest, we've lost some of the greatest percentages of pre-European settlement wetland acreage in the country. So here in Illinois, we've lost about 85% of our pre-European settlement wetlands. And these are the amphibian breeding sites. They need those habitats. In the 1930s, most of those wetlands were replaced by artificial farm ponds. And while some species like bullfrogs and green frogs can still use those farm ponds, many of them began to be stocked with game fish. So people wanted, you know, a fishing pond in their yard, and because amphibians need to lay their eggs and have their eggs hatch into tadpoles, breed in these ponds, they often cannot coexist with fish. Bullfrogs can do okay, green frogs can do okay, but then what you end up getting is this kind of skewed community structure where you have these kind of dominant larger frog species and fewer of kind of the ephemeral pool species like the spring peepers, which we all like to hear. So in addition to that, land use change, intensification of row crop agriculture, along with grazing, has increased the amount of fertilizer and pesticide runoff that is entering those remaining wetlands that are left on the landscape. And so in our program, in our community science program, the Calling Frog Survey, we do work really closely with land managers from the various forest preserve districts and park districts. And we try to help identify priorities for wetland restoration and provide data to show them which species are occurring in the various wetlands. So despite our best efforts to try to restore these habitats, roads are going to represent this continued obstacle that frogs are going to have to deal with. Just because they're small species, they have limited dispersal if you compare them to a taxonomic group like birds that can fly over the roads and colonize new restoration sites. That's much more challenging when you think about a very small terrestrial organism that has a lot of constraints on its physiology and its ability to move on the landscape. So we can think about what types of habitats we may find these species in, and we can look for the restored sites and the remnant sites and really try to figure out which species make up those communities and how they're doing, whether those communities are showing trends of increasing diversity, increasing abundance, whether they're really dynamic, which most of them are very dynamic through time. And so if we consider frog habitat, we're talking about aquatic habitat. So this is going to be both flowing and standing water, so streams and rivers, as well as ponds, lakes, marshes, swamps, and ditches. And for each species, each frog has its own breeding requirements with regard to what we call the wetland hydroperiod or pond permanence. So some species are going to elect to breed in really temporary or ephemeral wetlands. So these are pools that are going to fill with snowmelt in February or March as the temperatures start warming. Then they'll fill up even more with spring rains if you're not in a drought year like we are right now. And they're going to lay their eggs there. Eggs are going to hatch. Tadpoles have to develop quickly before the pond dries up. So they do have this race against time, and it's really hard for those species in a drought year, but they're being smart about avoiding predation. They're picking places to breed where predatory fish can't survive. And so that's why these temporary little ephemeral isolated wetlands are really critical. Then we have species that like semi-permanent ponds. So they may realize there's a risk involved. So they may pick ponds that dry some years, but not every year. And then there are species that can coexist with fish, and those are going to be your bullfrog and green frog. And they're going to lay their eggs in permanent bodies of water. And one of the strategies that they have is that their tadpoles can actually overwinter in the pond. So in spring, you might go to the edge of a lake and you might see these really huge, 2-3 inch long tadpoles and think, wow, are these from this year? These things are huge, but they're actually tadpoles from previous years. They've overwintered, spent the winter in the pond. And the strategy is get as big as you can before metamorphosis so that you have the best chance of survival and acquiring food resources once you metamorphose and move on to land. So we can take a look at the amphibian life cycle, and I'm sure this is familiar to many people already, but the term amphibian refers to the two-phase life cycle that these frogs have. So because they're spending time inland and on the water, that makes them really critical indicators of ecosystem health, aquatic environment, water quality, lack of contaminants, success of terrestrial environments in terms of ease of movement. So in this example, this life cycle example, we've got some wood frogs, and when wood frogs mate, they have external fertilization. This is the case for all of our regional frogs. They have external fertilization, so the males are going to call, and that's one of the ways we identify which species are present. Each species has a unique species-specific call. The female is going to respond to the call of the male, and then they're going to go to the pond she's going to deposit the eggs. He's going to fertilize them as they're being deposited into the water. And they usually need some emergent and submerged vegetation to be present in the pond as a substrate for them to lay their eggs on. This is one of the sources of in-pond dissolved oxygen through photosynthetic subsidies. And those eggs are going to hatch. It could be as short as 4 days in the case of a chorus frog. It could take about 2 weeks for some of the larger frogs for those eggs to hatch. And then they're going to go into the aquatic form of their life cycle, where they're larvae, they're tadpoles. And the tadpoles don't have keratin on their body. They have 2 really thin layers of epidermis, and they're permeable to the water. So they're taking in nutrients, they're drinking and breathing through the skin and through very small gills. And then the only keratin that they really have on their body is on their mouth parts. So they're grazing on algae and biofilm that's growing in the pond on the logs and submerged rocks and things like that. And so as the pond water starts drying down, the temperature increases, the dissolved oxygen decreases, and all of those environmental stressors actually cue a really interesting kind of series of hormone cycles that result in the stimulation of the hormone leptin that actually cues the development of limb buds. So they grow their back legs first, and then they develop their front legs. Then they slowly resorb their tail. They start gulping air. Their skin becomes increasingly keratinized, and they need that keratin to be able to move on land so that they can climb over rocks and sticks without being injured. And then they make their way into the terrestrial environment. And they actually spend about 80 to 90% of their time in the upland habitat, and they're really focused on the aquatic environment for breeding. So with the adult frogs, some can be aquatic, some are semi-aquatic, and some are highly terrestrial. It's going to vary species by species, and we'll take a look at those different groups. But they all really require water to lay their eggs. And again, the tadpoles are primarily herbivorous, but the adults are carnivorous. They can eat anything they can fit in their mouths. And as an example of that, when I used to live in southern Nevada, I once saw a bullfrog try to eat a starling. So they will just grab whatever they can fit in their mouths. They are primarily nocturnal, and because of that, we can hear them really well at night. That's when they're most active, but you can still see them during the day, especially if it's somewhat overcast and if it's raining out. A day like today would be a good day to go out and see some frogs kind of hanging out, but most of their breeding migration is going to be on rainy nights in spring. So as I mentioned, frogs have permeable skin, and that's one of the challenges they have in terms of moving across the landscape because they can desiccate really easily. So to reduce water loss, this is one of the reasons that they limit most of their activity to the nighttime, because the relative humidity is greater, the temperature is cooler, the desiccation risk is lower, and they're less visible to a lot of predators. And having that permeable skin is really important to them because it's not only a way they can drink and cycle nutrients, but it's a surface for gas exchange. It's one of their modes of respiration. So it passes oxygen from the water and from the environment into their capillaries. So it's one of the really neat adaptations to being able to live in both land and water. So we'll take a look as we go through our 13 regional frog species at some of their vocal communication, because this is really one of the best ways we can determine not only which species are present in a site, but which species are actually trying to breed in a site. So the main type of communication that we're cueing in on is called an advertisement call. And this is the call that the male makes to attract a mate. We'll also hear aggressive calls, and this is when they're having their little territorial scuffles. So one male is getting too close to another male's turf, and they'll kind of make some grunting chuck sounds to chase them off. You'll hear release calls occasionally where maybe males are wrestling for access to a female, or when they've finished mating, and the male will let go. They do a little release chirp. We also hear courtship calls, which are just a slight variant on the main advertisement call. And that's when the female is approaching the male, and he's basically trying to get her to respond and move toward him. He just does a little bit of a variant of the main call. And sometimes we will hear a distress call. It's always a bit unsettling if you do happen to hear this when a frog gets grabbed by a predator. It's not a pleasant sound. And it varies species by species. But it's really interesting. The more time you spend in the wetland environment, the more sounds you start to recognize. And then, of course, there's all the secretive marsh birds and everything else making sound. So it's a really actually noisy environment when you're trying to cue in on certain things. So because each frog and toad has a unique species-specific breeding call, we can use this to determine distribution of species in the region. We can use it to determine presence. And we say individual frogs call, but when we have a group, we say that they chorus. And so most frogs chorus best at night. So you might hear them all around you and not actually see them, because many of them are really quite small. So just a quick little plug for our Calling Frog survey program. This was a program that was started by Chicago Wilderness back in 2000, and then it was at Great Lakes Audubon for a number of years. It came to Peggy Notebaert Nature Museum in 2014, and the impetus for starting this survey was because this little guy here, the cricket frog, was once one of the most common amphibians in northern Illinois, and it has largely disappeared from the northern third of the state. So we want to prevent that from happening to any other species. And even though you may think, oh, bullfrogs are everywhere, they're common, we care about keeping the common species common. We want to keep our finger on the pulse of what is going on in terms of population trends with all of these species. And because, you know, I spend a lot of time with amphibians, but I'm one person and I can maybe get to 6 sites in the course of a day, and that's a lot. So the more people we have involved in the program, the more efficiently we can collect quality data. And the more you come back and monitor, and thanks to Mary Alice, who is one of our longest running frog monitors, we can determine trends when we have repeated data from the same sites over time. So if you're interested, certainly encourage you to participate. We're actually at the end of our second round of sampling right now, so we would ask you to sign up for a future season, but you can certainly get a jump on, see what I did there, a jump on learning your frog calls. So when we look at the frogs of the region, each of them have their particular phenology or order of activity and emergence. And so we split our season into 3 rounds. And the first part of the season, it can start as early as late February and go into the end of April. And these are going to be your ephemeral pool breeders, the species that are going to come out early and breed in these temporary kind of snowmelt ponds. And they're trying to finish up breeding and have their tadpoles metamorphose before everything dries up. Then we have our round 2 species, which tend to be more semi-permanent breeding species, like leopard frogs and American toads and the gray tree frogs. And then we have our round 3 species, which are going to be our green frogs and cricket frogs and bullfrogs that tend to use more permanent water, so they can kind of take their time, build up their energetic resource before they start calling, because females tend to respond to the frogs that have a faster call rate or greater call duration when they're selecting a mate. So if you're overwhelmed and you're trying to learn all your frogs, I suggest carving it up by season and learning them as groups, because if you think of, okay, what are the ephemeral pool breeders? These would be the ones that you would need to learn first. And that might be 4 or 5 species. Then you take the next group, and then you take the last group, and it's a much easier way to try to tackle learning all of these sounds and identifications. So I'll get into the fun part. First species that we're going to see generally, and one of the first species that we would hear in a year is the wood frog. And most of our frogs in the region and in North America have undergone quite a bit of taxonomic revision and phylogenetic reanalysis. So there's a lot of arguments about what their proper Latin name is. So depending on what field guide edition you have, you may see them written as Rana or Lithobates. So I've put both in the slide so that you have both if you're interested. But for the purpose of our talk, this is wood frog. Sylvaticus means woodland or wood. So that's one of the ways you can remember it. And these guys are one of my favorites because I worked on reintroducing them in Lake County since 2004. And we're now in our third or fourth generation post reintroduction where they have established, and we're trying to expand them out to new sites. And this has been a really successful effort. So I'm always excited to talk about wood frogs. They can range in color from kind of brown, bronze to more coppery or salmony color, and they're only about 2 inches long. So this is the smallest member of our pond frog family, Ranidae. And one of the things that tells them apart is that they have this dark brown robber mask. So it starts from their snout and it goes past their eye and it kind of fans out over their eardrum, but then they have this white lip line underneath, and that's really distinctive to the wood frog. Another thing that tells us this is a wood frog and not a chorus frog, which also has a dark line through the eye, is that they have this glandular fold on their back. This is called a dorsolateral ridge because it separates the dorsum from the lateral, the back from the side part of their body. And so some species have this ridge, some do not. And so as you look at the photos I'll show, pay attention to how big that ridge is, whether it goes down the entirety of the back, whether they have one at all, or whether the back is completely smooth. So wood frogs have a very prominent dorsolateral ridge. And here in this slide, you can see some of the variation in color. You can see that some of these are kind of pinkish almost, and some are very red, and some are more olive drab. They are one of our 2 earliest species to begin chorusing. And they usually start calling in March or in early April, and they may be active when snow or ice is present on the pond. And this is the only species of frog that lives in Alaska, our only species that can survive north of the Arctic Circle. 65% of the water in their body can freeze solid, and they can survive that. They actually overwinter in little burrows in the terrestrial environment, basically under the leaf litter. They kind of twist their body and like shimmy to make a little shallow depression in the soil, and they overwinter in that. And that burrow is called a form, and they survive the winter basically just below the leaf litter in the mud on land. And so these are very rare in northeastern Illinois. In terms of forest and habitat type, they like larger tracts of mesic forests and flatwoods, so shallow ephemeral pools. And so far, they've only been documented in a few isolated locations in northeastern Illinois. For the Chicago Wilderness region, northwestern Indiana, Valparaiso area, Indiana Dunes, this is really their stronghold for the region. They still persist in that dune swale habitat. There are ephemeral pools in those dune swale forests along the lakeshore in northwest Indiana. We've lost a lot of that habitat along Illinois' strip of lakeshore in the Chicago region. So unfortunately, they're not a very widespread species. We really don't get them much further west than the Des Plaines River. But if you really want to hear them at their peak, I certainly recommend checking out Indiana Dunes in late March. That's really the best time to try to hear them. And these are ephemeral pool breeders. And they're what we call explosive breeders. So they will chorus and breed in basically the course of a week. So they might call 2 nights, they may call as many as 7 nights, but they usually don't call for more than a week and a half, and that's it. So that's the explosion of breeding activity versus a species like a chorus frog, which is a prolonged breeder that we'll hear basically from late February into May most years. Those guys will continue to call. Wood frogs, you just get a few nights and that's it. So because of it, that they're very easy to miss and their call is quite subtle. They have a 2-note call that's kind of like a quack. It sounds like a so this is my frog impression section. I'll actually play the real call for you. When you hear them chorus, it sounds, I think, kind of like creepy laughter in the woods. So we'll play a call for you here. So what's making that really difficult to hear when you're in the environment is that the wood frogs are inflating the vocal pouch underwater. And when you hear the differences in how audible some of these calls are, you'll understand why some of these species are often missed when we're out doing our surveys. Wood frogs, leopard frogs, pickerel frogs, they all inflate the vocal pouch in the water, so it's automatically muffled to our ears. It's a low call, it's a low frequency call, and it's often just a few notes or kind of a droning call that can get drowned out when you have the noise of the other calls, like the chorus frog call and the spring peeper call, which are calling in the air, inflating their vocal pouch, and that sound travels much further. So our next species is the boreal chorus frog, Pseudacris maculatum. I will say that up until about 2005 or 2006, it was thought that we had Western chorus frogs here. There was a genetic analysis done by some researchers at Illinois Natural History Survey a number of years ago, and they did some phylogenetic analyses and found that we actually have, in most of the state, we have boreal chorus frogs. We do have Western chorus frogs, but they're mostly in extreme southern Illinois. So the boreal chorus frog and the Western chorus frog have almost indistinguishable calls, and they both have 3 lines running down their back. So it's subtle differences, but depending if you're looking at an old field guide or a new field guide, it may say Western chorus frog versus boreal, but we do only have one species here, which is the boreal chorus frog. And these guys, I'm sure you all will have heard, they have 3 lines running down their back. And so that's one of the distinguishing features. They do have this dark stripe that goes through the eye and through the eardrum or the tympanum, but it doesn't kind of fan out like we saw in the wood frog. And unlike the wood frog, they have a smooth back. They don't have that dorsolateral ridge at all. So those are some ways you can tell them apart. And these are smaller frogs. They only get up to about 1.5 inches in length. And here you can see some examples of variation in their color patterns. And so some of this is just typical variance, but one of the things that I've certainly noticed working in some sites that are fairly isolated just because of being surrounded by very busy high traffic roads is that we start to see a lot of aberrations and likely expression of loss of genetic diversity, probably expression of inbreeding over time, where you start to see frogs like the one in the middle here, where the pattern is really highly skewed and it's missing some of the stripes, the pattern's breaking up. We tend to see that in populations that have very low genetic diversity. And so that is an effect of habitat fragmentation and genetic isolation over time. But this is still one of the most common species in our region. They do have a fairly prolonged breeding season going again from late February, some years, certainly March, into May, and some years early June. And these are temporary pool breeders. They will breed in roadside ditches. They'll breed in detention basins. They'll breed in semi-permanent ponds as well. And they'll have multiple rounds of breeding. So you'll keep hearing the males calling through the season. And they're often heard, rarely seen. And the call is described as somebody running their fingers over the teeth of a comb. So it's an escalating trill. If you were to like draw it on a musical staff, it would be a series of escalating notes. And I expect most of you have heard this. These guys have been reported from about 85% of our frog survey routes. They are really one of the most common ephemeral pool breeding species that we have in the Chicago region. So related to them, but a distinct species, we have the spring peeper, and they are Pseudacris crucifer. And the species name crucifer refers to this X shape or cruciform shape on the back of the frog. These are also small ephemeral pool breeding frogs. They are tan, brown to kind of goldish color. And sometimes that X is very faint. Sometimes it's very bold, dark brown. They have adhesive toe pads. So they are more arboreal than the chorus frogs. The chorus frogs can climb a little bit, but these guys are a little bit more adept climbers with those sticky toe pads. And they're also less than 1.5 inches long. They also have this little dark bar between the eyes, and that's one of their distinguishing features as well. So as I mentioned, we see variance on the color pattern with the X. They don't all have X's. I caught one in southeastern Lake County that had about 6 X's on its back. So you do see these little bits of variation over time in some of the patterning. And here you can see some of the color variation that we see. So they used to be more widespread. This is a species that we're seeing or hearing from fewer sites through time. They are restricted to some of the larger kind of contiguous forested tracts. If a site is carved up and has a little patch of forest, you don't tend to see it. They like kind of more forested areas, but they also will breed in marshes. So they'll use both habitats. But one of the things that we think is happening is that they need a lot of emergent vegetation for laying their eggs. So when sites get too closed canopy above the breeding ponds where it shades out the emergent vegetation, they lose that site for oviposition and they stop using it. And so some of the habitat management restoration efforts that we've seen that seems to be improving their distribution is some of those oak restoration management techniques where they're trying to create more canopy gaps in the forest to allow greater amounts of light to transmit down to the forest floor with the goal of increasing oak recruitment. But it also opens things up a little bit and allows more opportunity for plant growth within the pond, and that creates more structure for egg laying for these guys. So they will use ephemeral and semi-permanent ponds as well as marshes, and their call is very descriptive of their name. They're saying peep or peeper like that. And sometimes the males you'll hear in this recording will do a territorial trill that can sound a lot like the call of the chorus frog. So if you imagine that fingers on a comb chorus frog call, it's like that, but if they had a kind of a sore, raspy throat. So I'll play that for you. That's the territorial trill. So when they really, oops, I went the wrong way. When they really start calling loudly, it almost sounds like sleigh bells. And if you're standing by a pond with a full chorus of them, you almost need to plug your ears. It can get so loud. So our next species is the northern leopard frog, Lithobates pipiens. And this is one that is fairly widespread through the region, but it's often missed because it does have a very subtle call, kind of hard to hear, but most people have seen these in both wooded and grassland sites. And they tend to be tan to green as their background color. Sometimes they're almost neon iridescent green. And they've got a brown eardrum or tympanum. It's brown and tan. And that's going to help distinguish it from a similar species we'll take a look at shortly. So they have these oblong, oval, or round spots that are brown, but they have a light margin around them, a little light border, and they have a really bold dorsolateral ridge going down their body. So it's continuous, it's the entire length of the frog's body. And these are a little bit longer than any of the other species we've looked at so far. They're about 4 inches in length. And as I mentioned, we are seeing some of these signs of loss of genetic diversity, even in their patterns, where in these 2 individuals, you see that some of those ovals have now become kind of fused patterns where they're becoming almost linear. And again, this is just a manifestation of loss of genetic diversity over time from isolation. So northern leopard frogs still are locally common, but in some parts of North America and some parts of their range, they've undergone tremendous rapid declines, or they experience really wide swings in abundance from year to year. In fact, earlier this year, I was talking with a graduate student who's trying to do a reintroduction program with them in the state of Washington. They used to be widespread through Washington state, and they are down to a single site that has them. So now they're trying to get stock from populations in Idaho and do captive rearing and try to reintroduce them in Washington. But they're really having trouble isolating what that driving force behind that decline is, if it's climate change, if it's disease, if it's a combination of them, because leopard frogs are particularly susceptible to both chytrid and ranavirus. So we do see them kind of exhibit symptoms of some of these diseases more so than some of the other frogs in our region. They tend to breed in wet meadows and prairies, and they use edges of marshes and semi-permanent wooded ponds. And their call is one of these quiet ones because they're calling underwater. So it sounds like a snore, or one of the other descriptions is a finger being rubbed on a dry balloon. I think it sounds like snoring, and then there's usually this kind of coarse chuckle sound at the end of the snore. And when they're doing their territorial call, they tend to do a lot of these short chuck sounds, which start to sound like wood frog calls. And so for our monitors, that's often one that can be confusing. So I do ask people, if they're not sure, to record. They think they're hearing, let's say, a wood frog in a grassland. Wood frogs don't occur in grasslands, but northern leopard frogs do. And so if they hear something that sounds like a wood frog, it's probably the territorial call of the leopard frog. So we can take a listen to that. So our next species is the American toad. They also went under some taxonomic revision. So they used to be Bufo, now they're Anaxyrus americanus. And this is the most terrestrial of the species that we have in the region. So these guys are going to move over land. You're going to see them in gardens and in parks and backyards. And they have this kind of thick, warty skin. And these aren't actual warts. They're actually clusters of toxin glands called granular glands. And this is one of the things that enables them to move over land, because they're covered in toxin glands that keeps them safe from a number of predators that might try to eat them. It makes them distasteful. And that thicker skin helps them be more desiccation resistant as they're moving between aquatic environments. So American toads, they will have kind of dark spots on their back with these warts or granular gland clusters in those dark spots. And they tend to have between 1 and 3 of the warts in each spot. That's going to help distinguish it from another species of toad, the Fowler's toad, that historically occurred in parts of the region. They also have a heavily spotted belly. So if you see a toad that has lots of splotches and spots on its belly, it's likely an American toad. And they're usually less than 3.5 inches in length. And another way that we tell them apart from the Fowler's toad is by these crests on the top of their head. These are called cranial crests, and it kind of makes a little L shape behind the eye. It's basically where this arrow is pointing here. So in the American toad, you can see that there's a little bit of a gap between that crest and between that large kind of oval gland called the parotoid gland behind the crest. Sometimes it's completely disconnected, and sometimes it is connected with a little spur extension to the crest. In the Fowler's toad, those crests are right up against that large parotoid gland. So that's one of the ways you can distinguish them. If you take a photo of the top of the toad's head, that's one way to help tell them apart. So they're widespread and probably one of the more adaptable species of frogs in the area. As I mentioned, they do well in backyards. They like to eat earthworms and a lot of soil arthropods. And they will breed in a lot of semi-permanent ponds, streams, rivers. I know we have them in the park around the corner from my house in kind of a small, shallow lake or man-made pond there. And the call is, I think, really one of the prettiest calls of the frogs in the region. It's a prolonged trill, but it's kind of one note. So if you were to write it again on a musical staff, it would be one sustained note rather than an escalating trill. It's also described as a whistling whir. And sometimes when they're kind of wrestling with each other, doing territorial scuffles, you'll hear this little gurgle sound. So I'll play their trill for you. And this is a species that is breeding right now. So chances are you may have heard it if you were somewhere with water recently. So that's their release call. And that's a turf war. So this next species is one I would personally love to see more of here in Illinois. This is the pickerel frog, Lithobates palustris, and these are highly, highly rare in our region. They look a bit like the northern leopard frogs, but I'll show some side-by-side photos so you can kind of see the difference. Instead of having ovals or circular patterns on their back, they have somewhat squarish blocks or spots, and they're in roughly parallel rows compared to the leopard frogs, where you kind of have this staggered kind of disarray of ovals. These guys tend to have a pair of these squarish blocks going down their backs. They also have a patch of yellow gold color on the thigh and hind leg on the side of the belly. And they have a much more rounded snout compared to the northern leopard frog. They're a little bit smaller. They're less than 3 inches in length. And here they are side by side, so you can kind of see the difference in the snout, particularly. The photo on the left is the pickerel frog, so you can see that it's this nice, smooth, rounded snoot. If you look at the photo on the right, we see a much more pointed nose in the leopard frog. So they're a little more aerodynamic, a little faster generally. And you could again see those roughly parallel series of squared off spots down the back of a pickerel frog versus the ovals on the leopard frog. So unfortunately, these are likely extirpated in the immediate Chicago region. They haven't been documented since the late 1940s, but we do have some isolated recent observations out from Nachusa grasslands, which is really exciting. These are usually found near wooded areas that have groundwater fed springs, streams, and ponds. And you still have that at Nachusa, but through most of our region, the hydrology has been so highly altered over the years that we've lost that groundwater fed spring system. So there are still some sites, some of the fens in the region and some of the headwater streams in McHenry County that have the potential for this species showing up. But really Nachusa is the only place that that we've detected them in the survey in the last decade or so. And if you do want to hear them, if you go out to points west, like Joe Davies County, Apple River Canyon, this is a good place to hear them. You still have a lot of that hydrology intact, but really our hydrology has just been too drastically altered through time with a lot of the drainage tile and river diversions and things like that that have happened. So they do chorus kind of toward the end of our first round of sampling and into the beginning of the second round. They're an April-May breeding species. And the call is also kind of a snore. It's another underwater kind of inflated vocal pouch call, but it sounds a bit like the frog is saying meow, like that, or like I think it sounds like an angry cow, but you can decide for yourself. That one sounds like it has indigestion. So it's a really unique sound, and sometimes you get a leopard frog snore that kind of sounds a little bit like it, but it has this really interesting kind of arcing cadence. If you look at like a spectrogram of what the call structure looks like, which is one of the things I do in calling frog survey, if people send me recordings and they're trying to discern what species something is, if it's really similar sounding to another species, I can look at it through our software and look at the shape of the call, look at the frequency, and really pinpoint which species it is that way. So that's one of the reasons these auditory surveys are really helpful. Another species in our region, but kind of the southern edge of the Chicago wilderness region, is the plains leopard frog, Lithobates blairii. And these are tend to be sand prairie species, so we don't really see them much in our immediate area. But they look superficially similar to the northern leopard frog. They have more rounded, more circular polka dot-like spots rather than ovals on them, and the margin of those is a little bit more irregular than on the northern leopard frog. And they're usually about the same size, also up to about 4 inches in length. But they have this white spot on the center of the eardrum or tympanum. And if you remember back to the northern leopard frog, and I will show them side by side again, they have a solid brown eardrum with a tan pattern versus this one that has the tan and then the white spot in the center. The other distinguishing feature for the plains leopard frog is this break in that dorsolateral ridge. So they still have a ridge, but it's somewhat weaker than in the northern leopard frog, where it's a very bold ridge that goes from the snout through the end of the body without any breaks in it. In some individuals of the plains leopard frog, that ridge tends to just taper to nothing, so they don't all have a break and then a continuation like this one in the photo. Sometimes it just stops there and it's called an interrupted ridge, but that's one of the distinguishing features of the plains leopard frog. So here they are side by side, and you can see the white spot in the tympanum of the plains leopard frog on the left versus the tan tympanum of the northern leopard frog on the right. And you can see that in the northern leopard frog, the spots are more oval versus more circular, polka dotty in the plains leopard frog on the right. And again, take a look at that dorsolateral ridge going down their back. We have the break in the dorsolateral ridge in the plains leopard frog and that really strong, bold ridge in the northern leopard frog. Now, you may find northern leopard frogs in the same sites that plains leopard frogs may occur in, but plains leopard frogs have much more site and habitat specificity than the northern leopard frogs do. So these are rare in the region. The plains leopard frog is really only known from extreme eastern and southern Will County, as well as Grundy County. So places like Goose Lake Prairie would be a good place to listen for them. Mandeo and National Tallgrass Prairie would be another good place to listen for them. They like sand prairies and semi-permanent prairie ponds. And their call, it doesn't really have as much of the snore component. It has this very distinctive chirp, 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 chirp kind of cadence, this like triplet of chucks that they make. So I'll play their call. You're going to hear a couple of other species. At first, you're going to hear cricket frogs calling, and then you'll hear the plains leopard frog, and then there's going to be an eastern gray tree frog calling in the background. But you're listening for that chuck, 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 that. So all the clicking is cricket frogs. So now we'll move on to the gray tree frogs, which are also still calling right now. So this is another species that you may have heard. And we have two morphologically identical species of gray tree frogs in the region, but we have some differences in their range and in their call. So they look alike. We've got the Cope's gray tree frog, which is Hyla chrysoscelis, and the eastern gray tree frog, which is Hyla versicolor, both in northern Illinois. And so you can't really tell which is which until you hear them call. And so both gray tree frogs, they're going to be about 2 inches in length, and they have this large vocal pouch. Their back can be extremely variable in color, anywhere from green to gray, and they kind of have a pattern that matches the lichens of the trees because they're very arboreal. So they tend to have darker blotches on the back. They have this light green spot on right below the eye, and in the juveniles they tend to have a little bit less patterning on the back, but they still do have that light spot in the eye. And you see those big sticky toe pads and this yellow gold color on the hind leg and thigh. So both the eastern and Cope's gray tree frogs will have this general appearance. So for the eastern gray tree frog, they're somewhat uncommon and also restricted to larger wooded tracts that have semi-permanent ponds. And where they do occur, we have very large populations, but they're patchy throughout the landscape. And in northeastern Illinois, the eastern gray tree frogs really only occur from the Des Plaines River and Lake Michigan drainages. So you get Cope's gray tree frog at points west of there. So if you're down along the lake shore or in the Des Plaines River corridor and you hear a gray tree frog, it's likely going to be an eastern gray tree frog. Again, you can hear both of them from late April into late June. So right now in May is kind of the peak of their calling. and they have a very pretty slow musical trill. And so the eastern gray tree frog is going to have the more flute-like, more bird-like call. So we'll play that for you. That's the call right there. And they call faster the warmer they are. So that's how fast they can get. Now the Cope's gray tree frog, which is what you would find in Kane County, is known along the Fox River drainage as well as the Kishwaukee River drainage. And it's also somewhat patchy in where it occurs. So they also like this wooded habitat, and you may find them along some of the floodplain forests. But the call is much more harsh. It's more of a buzzing trill, and I think it sounds almost a bit cicada-like compared to the more kind of fluty, bird-like, slower trill of the eastern gray tree frog. So it's almost a little bit more mechanical sounding. So we'll play that. So now we're moving into the third round of species, the late breeding species. And so the first one is going to be the green frog, which I'm sure many of you have heard. This is one of the more common species of the region, and both green frogs and bullfrogs are likely increasing in abundance because they can use a lot of man-made ponds and golf course ponds and detention basins, as well as sites with fish. And they can range from green to brown in color. And they have a dorsolateral ridge, that glandular folds of skin that goes halfway down their back. So it doesn't go all the way down to the end of the body. It kind of stops just past their shoulder. But the presence of that ridge is one of the ways you can tell them apart from a bullfrog. In bullfrogs, that ridge does not actually extend down the back at all. They just have the fold that goes along the tympanum, that ridge around the eardrum. So in both bullfrogs and green frogs, you can tell the males apart from the females by the size of the diameter of the tympanum relative to the diameter of their eye. So the males are going to have a diameter of their eardrum larger than the eye. The female's eardrum is going to be about the same size or smaller than the diameter of their eye. So this individual would clearly be a male green frog. And green frogs are still relatively common and again, likely increasing, but they prefer heavily vegetated, kind of duckweed heavy, semi-permanent and permanent bodies of water, again, because those tadpoles can overwinter. They can take a full year to complete metamorphosis. And we heard some of their calls in the background a moment ago. It kind of sounds like a loose banjo string, like a wang, wang, or a series of gulps. So we'll play that. And when they're disturbed, if you walk up to a pond with green frogs, they're going to give a little warning call that's going to sound like a much daintier species. It's a little squeak. So I'll go ahead and play that. So that's a green frog jumping off of a log and just going. So it sounds like a very different species. You wouldn't think it would come from this large-bodied frog. So then we have our cricket frog, which again is really that flagship species for the existence of our program, because this is a species that has lost a lot of ground in northern Illinois. The cricket frog is Acris crepitans, and it's a very small frog. It's the smallest frog in the region. They only get up to about an inch in length, and they have really colorful patterning on their skin, although some are more muted than others. They can have this kind of moss green stripe, or sometimes a red stripe or orange stripe down their back. And then the rest of their body tends to be tan or coppery. And they can have very warty skin, kind of like a toad, but they don't have those big parotoid glands behind the eye or the crest, the cranial crest that we looked at in the American toad. Instead, they're very dainty. They have fairly long hind legs with these very kind of bold crossbars across the hind legs. And despite variation in color, they all have this kind of dark triangular pattern behind the eyes. So that's one of the ways you can tell them apart from some of the other species like a toad that would have the warts on its back. So here are some more that are a little bit more muted in color. You still see a little bit of the green moss color, or the little red brown stripe, and they all have those distinct crossbars and the triangle behind the eyes. And the cricket frog is considered a semi-aquatic species. They spend a lot of time in the water, and they live along the banks of permanent water bodies. So you'll find them in small streams and small rivers, as well as large ponds. And again, they've undergone quite a bit of decline, but they are still scattered kind of in the outskirts of the southern end of the region, northern Will County and Grundy County, southern DuPage, southern Kane, and DeKalb County. So for Kane County, Big Rock Preserve is a site that would have them. Historically, we've picked them up there. If you're near DeKalb County, Santa Forest Preserve, we've picked them up there as well. And then if you go out to Medea, when you can hear them calling right by the visitor center. This species only lives about a year and a half or so. So they have this annual life cycle. So what happens is if you have successive years of drought where they can't reproduce, that can really knock back their distribution if they can't get to somewhere where there's still a water source. And the more fragmented the habitat is, the more you see them kind of struggle to reestablish. And so right at the boundary of DuPage and Will County, we see from one year to the next, like they're pretty well established at Keepataw Preserve in Will County. Some years we pick them up across the river and across the road at Waterfall Glen, but not every year. And it may be only a few calls some years, and they may be more robust other years. So they have this kind of wavering boundary as they're trying to establish. So it's a really interesting species, certainly distribution wise. And they tend to chorus in late spring and summer, and the call speeds up like a series of ticks. It speeds up in the middle and then slows down at the end. So we'll go ahead and play that. And they sound like crickets. That's where they get that cricket frog name. Another good place to see them, if you're interested, is Starved Rock and Matheson State Park. They love those sandstone canyons, and in September you can kind of see them hopping everywhere if you walk kind of along the floor of the canyon trails there. This is our next to last species is the Fowler's toad, Anaxyrus fowleri, and these guys are also fairly rare in the region. They're tan in color, and they have much more dark kind of prominent spots. And remember, with the American toad, they only have 1 to 3 warts per spot. With the Fowler's toad, they tend to have 4 or 5 warts per spot. They can have some with fewer, but they tend to have these kind of longer kind of bars with a series of these warts in these little swaths of dark coloration. And they're about the same size as the American toad, but they have a plain belly or a barely spotted belly compared to the heavy patterning that we see in the American toad. Oops. I was going to just say that you also can't really see the cranial crest distinctly in the Fowler's toad because it's right up against that gland. We don't have that space or that spur that connects them. And Fowler's toads are rare in the region, also a species that was restricted largely to sandy areas along the lakeshore. And because we've had so much lakeshore development in Illinois, we've really lost most of the habitat for them. They historically occurred in Lake and Cook counties. They are still at Indiana dunes. That is a good place to try to listen for them and look for them in that dune swale habitat. And their call is a pretty loud call. It's pretty distinctive. It's described as a sheep caught in a trap. It's kind of this loud, like, wah. So I'll play it for you. You won't mistake it for anything else. It's the only frog that sounds this way. Not necessarily the most peaceful sound to try to fall asleep by if you're camping, but I just love them. I think they're great. And you can see here just the difference in the warts per spot with the American toad on the left and the Fowler's toad on the right, and the difference in those prominent cranial crests in the American toad versus the Fowler's toad. And again, the difference in the plain belly of a Fowler's toad versus the spotted belly of the American toad. And so our last species is the bullfrog, Lithobates catesbianus. And again, this is one of our larger, more common species, increasing in abundance because they can coexist with fish and use artificial ponds and created habitats and golf course ponds. And they, again, just have this glandular folds of skin that goes around the eardrum. They don't have a ridge that extends back along the shoulder like the green frog does. So again, we can tell that this is a female because her eardrum is about equal to the size of her eye or smaller than the diameter of her eye versus that huge tympanum we saw in the male bullfrog. So that same rule of thumb applies for bullfrogs and green frogs. And these can get up to about 8 inches in length. So think like small kitten size, maybe 6-week-old kitten size, as kind of a maximum bullfrog size. These again will eat whatever they can catch. So here we have bullfrogs versus green frogs. So the bullfrog is on the left, and again you just see that fold around the eardrum. In the green frog on the right, you see that ridge that extends back and then kind of tapers off to nothing. Oops, that went the wrong way. So again, these are very common in permanent water bodies in the Chicago region, and they've likely increased over the last 2 decades. Up here, I have a photo of one of their tadpoles just getting hind limbs at this point in the season. So this is a tadpole from a previous year. They can often overwinter multiple years in the case of the bullfrog so that they can get really large before they complete metamorphosis. And they're going to chorus in the hottest part of the summer, late May through early July. And this is a characteristic kind of vroom, vroom sound. And if you startle them, they kind of make a noise like you're hitting a drum, and then you'll hear a splash. So I'll play that. Yep. Boom. Splash. And in addition to some of those color pattern variations I talked about that happen with genetic isolation, I just always like to show this because we do have color mutation where we get blue bullfrogs, and all three of these are actually DuPage County bullfrogs that we've come across in our survey work. And yeah, they're missing some of the yellow pigment. And interestingly, I've heard from some people who seen these in Kankakee area that they've seen them with just part of the body having the blue coloration, like this large female we're holding in the right-hand photo. She just has the blue around her mouth, and then the rest of the body is mostly green, versus the two in the middle and left-hand photo where the entire body is blue. So it's just a color mutation, and we do see it here and there, and it may become more common in more fragmented, isolated populations as well. Oops. So I know that's a lot of information to take in, so I do want to just point you to our website, which is frogsurvey.org. If you want to listen to any of the calls, if you want to read the species descriptions again, we do have resources available there, as well as call recordings. If you're interested in helping to contribute to our program for next season, we usually post our workshop dates on how to set up your survey route and how to enter the data and conduct the survey and assign a call index. We do those trainings typically in late January and February, and then monitoring can start as early as late February. We also have links on our website to a couple of other community science programs helping to track the phenology of different amphibians. So when you're seeing different species throughout the region, and all of these links are on our website. The Phenology Project through Midwest Partners in Amphibian and Reptile Conservation. Another project that we work on with Calling Frog Survey is helping to track light pollution. So if that's something you're interested in, we use this Loss of the Night app, which is a free phone app where you basically use your phone to see which stars are visible, and it gives you a magnitude of light pollution. And that's part of a global light pollution study, because light pollution does affect calling behavior of amphibians. So it's one of the reasons we're interested in gathering those data. And we are working with some colleagues at Adler Planetarium to try to learn more about the correlations and effects of light pollution on frog calling behavior in the Chicago region. So again, our website's frogsurvey.org, and if you're interested in any of the museum's other programs like Illinois Butterfly Monitoring, Odinate Survey, those are on our website here. And then I'll also point you to a different program, which is not based at the museum, which is the Singing Insect Survey. So if you monitor frogs and then when the frogs are done, you're looking for something else to go listen to at night in the forest preserves, Singing Insects is another great program to get involved with. So I know I'm probably running way long, so I will be happy to take any questions, and thank you so much.
Sorry, a little inept. We did have a few questions. That was fascinating. I honestly didn't know there were just that many frogs and toads in the area. So I've certainly heard the toads by me, and certainly we have a man-made pond, and those bullfrogs, they are the most enormous things. Anyway. But one person asked, and this was early on, she asked, you mentioned about COVID, and she said, is the COVID that the frogs or have is the same? Is it a different kind of
No,
COVID?
it's actually chytrid.
Chytrid, okay.
Yeah, sorry, I may
Okay.
have said COVID just because, you know, of life.
Well, it is new. Sometimes things get a little off.
Yeah, but you know, it's chytrid is a fungal pathogen,
Oh,
but they
okay.
do get ranavirus is viral, and then they also get Perkensia, which is a protist infection, and they get bacterial infections too. So we find this whole host of emerging pathogens affecting not just frogs, but you know, fungal pathogens affecting bats like white nose fungus, and there's just so many pathogens and stressors that these animals are dealing with.
Yeah.
So
So we have a number of questions in the Q&A. The first one is from Annette, and she said she has 2 green frogs living in each of 2 different aluminum pans in her backyard. She keeps adding water to each pan all summer. She said, is it okay to do this? She said she doesn't clean the pans. She just keeps adding water. Could this harm them, or may I do this again this year?
I mean, if it's a green frog, they're probably going to be able to get out of it on their own if they want to leave. If it's basically a little stopover for them, so that they have a place to sit and bask in the water, I don't see any harm in that.
Okay.
You know, for the long term, you would probably want to change out water, but if it's being filled with rainwater, that's not really different than some of the puddles and roadside ditches that
Okay.
they would use.
Good, okay. Patsy said recently she listened to Professor Tyrone Hayes from UC Berkeley talk briefly about his study of, I'm sure I'm saying this.
Atrazine.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you know, are you currently, or have you done any studies on the effect of pesticides on the health of frogs locally? And yeah.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
No,
Sorry.
it's just that what pesticide was studied and what effects.
Yeah, so I have not specifically done any work with pesticides. The ecotoxicology work that I've done is focused on actually the plant metabolite from invasive buckthorn called emodin that actually can disrupt amphibian egg development.
Oh,
And so
buckthorn's bad enough. Now it's doing that.
yeah,
Oh my gosh.
yeah. And I think your group had me speak about that a number of years back when I was in graduate school doing work on that. So certainly in our area, given the amount of corn production, especially out in DeKalb County and Lee and Ogle County, yeah, that's certainly a concern because we know atrazine is being used and Tyrone's work is incredible, and he's an incredible speaker. He has shown that it can basically induce feminization of male frogs through it's like 0.01 parts per billion of atrazine, and some of the colleagues I have who do pesticide specific work in Ohio have found that they have a really hard time conducting some of these studies because there's already that amount of atrazine in most rainwater. And so when they try to set up control mesocosms outdoors, just using, their control treatment ponds, and then they have their, higher dosage ponds, lower dosage ponds, even their controls have some atrazine in it just because it's in rainwater right now. So yeah, it's a problem.
That's different. Oh, right.
Yeah.
Horrible. This was, she asked how long it takes a tadpole to metamorphosize into a frog.
It depends on the species and conditions. So with certain species like the chorus frog, it takes them 96 hours to hatch. And then let's say they hatch in April, they probably won't metamorphose until June. With the wood frogs, they lay eggs late March, early April, take about 2 weeks to hatch. And then they usually hatch in mid-June, early July. So it's about a month and a half for different species, but depending on the water temperature and the dissolved oxygen content in the water, all of those things and the water level itself are cues that start this hormone cycle that trigger metamorphosis. So as the water temperature warms, its oxygen holding capacity is going to decrease. It's going to make it harder for them to breathe. So that's a stressor that's going to actually increase their glucocorticoids, their stress hormone, which triggers this production of a series of hormones that then produces the limb buds and cues tail resorption and that whole physical restructuring that they go through. So if they already have hind legs and they still have a tail and a pond is drying up, they can kind of hurry up and quickly finish metamorphosis. But in a year like this, we know that some of these ponds have not produced any metamorphs because a lot of the ponds dried the first week of May this year.
Right. Yeah. And hopefully we'll get a little more.
Yeah.
Okay. She said, why do frogs have warts? Well, you said they aren't really warts, but
Right. Yeah. So all frogs and all amphibians have toxin glands. They also have mucus glands in their skin, and it's usually like a ratio of 10 mucus glands to every toxin gland or granular gland that they have. But in the case of more terrestrial species like American toads and Fowler's toads, and in the case of salamanders, if you think of the red aft, the terrestrial stage of the newt that spends over a year kind of dispersing over land, the species that are spending more time on land need more defenses, so they tend to have this greater kind of proliferation of toxin glands to protect them from predators, just because they're more exposed.
Interesting. Okay. She said, oh, and no, she said, is COVID in the water? Well, it's spread by birds and mammals, the same as COVID. Well, it's not really COVID, you said, but is it
Yeah, not
spread
COVID.
by birds and mammals the way?
Chytrid, so chytrid is waterborne, and it can stay like stay alive in mud. So like if we walk into a pond with mud on our boots and the pond has chytrid, and then we walk into a different pond, there is a potential to spread it. So certainly in the herpetology world, we kind of obsessively decontaminate all of our gear when we're sampling. You could, if you're poking around different places, you can thoroughly clean your boots when you get home. And we do on our website, frogsurvey.org, we do have disinfection protocols if you're interested in that. Really, the best way to do it is clean the mud off of your boots, and you can let them dry. There's different ways to decontaminate them, but getting the mud off of them, that's where, because the mud does hold water, and the fungal spores are in the water, the zoospores are in the water, so it can spread that way. Certainly animals can spread it too. So it's one of these challenging things where we know that there's no way to really, shut down transmission in a natural ecosystem like that. But as researchers and monitors, we can do the most responsible thing, which is make sure we're cleaning our gear and that we're not helping spread a pathogen while we're trying to do conservation work and pay attention to what these species are doing.
Right. Good to know. Okay. And she said, okay, the difference between frogs and toads, but you really covered that a little bit. But she said, how does one tell?
So all toads are frogs, but not all frogs are toads. So toads are terrestrial.
So you gave, well, yeah, right.
Yeah.
So you gave a lot of pictures and so.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, toads generally have the warty skin. They're more
Right.
terrestrial toxins. Yeah.
And is it true that one should not handle frogs?
Excessive handling can dry out their skin, and if you have bug spray on and pick up a frog, that can be toxic to them. So we generally suggest admire them, with your eyes. We don't need to pick everything up. A lot of mosquito spray, DEET, things like that we might put on our clothes to try to prevent the ticks from getting to us can be toxic to them. So,
And
if you're
Danner season for ticks too, so I know.
no, I know, and I'm pulling them out of my hair every day. But we do what we can. So when we work with them for our studies, for our research, we wear gloves, nitrile gloves, and try to minimize anything on our hands, because we're using a lot of hand sanitizer these days, understandably, because of COVID, but certainly that has antimicrobial properties, obviously, for our health, but some of the microbiome for the amphibians is helping to protect them from pathogens in their environment. So we don't want to necessarily mess with their microbiome in that way. Yeah.
Okay, she says, I have a few frogs in my garden pond, but they never call. She said they're green and peek their eyes out from the water. They might be.
Well, it could be a variety of species, but if it's kind of a permanent body of water, it may just, if it's a garden pond, it may be too shallow for them to actually breed in, but they might be using it just as a refugia, which is really nice for them, because you know, backyard ponds are really important stopovers for them. If you think of the, you know, the landscape, you may have a nice preserve up here and a nice preserve down here. They need to get from point A to point B. And so by providing little pools, it's a stepping stone corridor, essentially, is what you're building. And so they may pass through, they may hang out there and feed, or basically just make sure they're not desiccating. So whether they're breeding there or not is going to depend on the depth and if there's fish and other things like that. If there's enough of, you know, the habitat structure that they're looking for egg laying.
Well, that's one of the things that we really push with is habitat corridor. So that's just another good way to talk about habitat.
Oh,
corridor.
yeah.
And one, I think it's the last question, but Liz Copeland is her name, and she's obviously from Kendall County, and she'd love to have you come out to do some surveys. And I imagine she can contact you through the frog survey if she
Oh,
wants
yes.
to do that.
Liz is a friend of mine on Facebook.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, then that's good. So, well, we are at the end of the questions, and I'm sure, I think I've covered it all, unless someone wants to put something in really quickly. So this was just fascinating. As I said, I'm not a frog monitor because my ability to hear sounds is not very good, but maybe it would get better listening to looking at what you've done, because it's just fascinating. And I hope it's successful in hoping, you know,
Oh,
keep
yeah.
our frog habitat alive.
Well, and I do want to say, for folks who feel like they may not be able to pick out the sounds as well, if you do see frogs, there are other ways to contribute monitoring data and presence data through iNaturalist, through HerpMapper, and we have those links on our website and the phenology. So you're not necessarily listening for the breeding calls, but
Okay.
just the presence of the species is valuable data points that
Good
that
to know.
researchers can use and managers can use. Yeah.
That's, because I noticed that on the participants there, I know there are a number of frog monitors on here, but it's good to know there are other things that one can do too.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, this was fascinating. I don't know if any of our panelists have anything else to say, but thank you so much. This was wonderful.
Thanks for
And
having me.
yes, so, and thank you to all of you who participated and came tonight. I hope you were as fascinated as I was, and overwhelmed with the amount of information. It was just wonderful. So thank you so much, Allison. And thank
You're
you
very
all for
welcome.
coming. And I hope you come to some of our next events, and we're looking forward to seeing you soon. Thank you and good night.
Good night.
Thanks, Allison.
I-
Night all.
Good night.
Good night.